Now, you do get some things from your Lord. You get protection. Remember, this was a big part of how the feudal system in Europe appeared in the first place. Right? You got local protection from invaders like the Vikings. You also were given a spot on the manor to build your shelter. And the more positive way to think about the Lord's mill and oven is that the Lord provides you with a way to turn your harvest into food. That's the mill and oven. And that was kind of important. It's not like people have food processors that they can plug into the electric outlet in their hut. Right? You need some way of grinding things, and that was like a pretty expensive setup. You also had a strong sense of certainty about your place in this life. You always had work, and you always had a home. All you had to do was obey. Now, that may not sound so great, but as we think about this and as we compare peasant life to life in America today, does a person in America always have certainty that they'll have a job and a place to live? No. Right? In a feudal system, as long as you did what you were told, you always had employment and you always had a place to live. Were those things great? No, but they were certain. You could count. And that leads us on to peasant life. All right, and here we're going to be switching back to Europe. Sorry, I know that's kind of a jarring transition. Remember, peasants in any of our systems were not necessarily truly at the bottom of the feudal hierarchy, but their lives were in many ways at the mercy of the people above them. The knights, the alii, the daimyo, whatever the system. And their lives were so greatly affected because they depended on what their superiors provided to them. Right? So what do you get as a peasant from those above you? What was required of you as a peasant by your superiors? Right? So what did they give you and what did they take? Also, what freedoms were you allowed by your superiors? And that's kind of a foreign concept to us. We really think about ourselves as having freedoms that our superiors have to protect and respect because we have rule of law and limited government. In a feudal system, though, you only have the freedoms that are allowed you by your superiors. In some cases, peasants were lucky enough to have some protections against their superiors. Now, the other factor here is both time and place in the medieval era. And what that means is that we're going to have to make generalizations. And generalizations are important because we can't talk about every specific place, and we wouldn't really want to. But there is a trade-off, and that's going to overlook some people who were exceptions to these rules, places that provided exceptions for people, but again, that's kind of a necessary evil for us. Our main goal is to take these generalizations and compare and contrast peasant life in different times and places. Rights, derechos. And as with last time, we're going to start in Europe. And so imagine that you are a European peasant, right? You are born into it. And you're going to remain in the peasantry as a peasant for your entire life. Now, good news, bad news, that's not going to be that long. You could only expect to live about 35 years if you were lucky enough not to die in childhood. And lots of things in childhood could kill you. And lots of the illnesses that you had as a kid that were cured with some bubblegum flavored amoxicillin, right, kill you, right? Because there is no amoxicillin. People don't know about germs, much less antibiotics. And in your 35 years, you would never travel very far from where you were born. At the outside, historians estimate that peasants might travel no more than 25 miles from the place of their birth. And that home that you never traveled very far from was probably a one-room shack. Really is too nice a word for it. It's just a hut made of sticks and mud. Right? The term for that is wattle and daub. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to call it sticks and mud. And in your one-room stick and mud hut, you slept with your animals, right? Whatever livestock you were lucky enough to have. And partly you kept your animals with you because they were a source of heat. Right. The idea of being able to heat your house with wood is kind of fanciful for a lot of these people, because when everyone is relying on wood for heat, deforestation happens, right? Plus, also cutting firewood takes a lot of time that you might not have. It's easier to just bring your animals inside and let their body heat warm your little mud and stick hut. And right, also to keep warm, right? And just because you don't have any better options, all of the family members are going to be sharing, right, a single mattress. Right? Well, and mattress is also really too kind of term for it. It really is just a pile of straw, right, that you kind of keep raked together into, well, kind of like just a bed you would use for livestock, right? If you ever know anybody who kept horses or anything like that, it'd be just kind of like some straw piled into a stall. And naturally, when you're in there with a bunch of people, you've got a dirt floor, you've got a bunch of livestock, it's going to be infested with bugs. It's just part of it. Because everybody's got lice, everybody has things like scabies. It's not a pleasant time. Scabies are little parasites that burrow under the skin. In the 21st century, they're largely considered just a sexually transmitted infection. But right, in earlier times, scabies were a part of life because everybody was living in filth. Nobody's taking baths, right, during much of this time either. And another thing that makes your life kind of difficult and makes you susceptible to getting sick is that your diet's not very good. Right? Now, some of it is healthy things you should be eating, like vegetables. But you also, if you ate bread, it was really tough, chewy, dark bread, right? Not that fluffy, soft white bread that you kids are used to. You maybe had some thin soups. And if you were lucky, you got a little bit of cheese. Right? Now, in the Pear Deck, I want you to tell me, what do you think is missing? Right? What is the glaring thing missing from this list of items in your diet? Well, tell it to the Pear Deck, Trent. We'll see if you're right. Tell it to the Pear Deck. All right. We're just going to give it to the countdown hits 15. What's missing? All right. Okay. And what you guys told me is protein, meat. Okay. So you might have gotten some milk in terms of that cheese, but meat is the main thing missing. They actually had protein. People got their protein from. But that's not protein. All right. Well, that's not what we want either, Pear Deck. Okay. You got your protein from vegetables, things like peas. And how many of you really enjoy eating peas? A few. I enjoy peas myself, but right, that's where a lot of your protein came from. And it is a good source of protein. Pea protein is used in a lot of the meat alternatives that are out there, like your Beyond Burgers. Right? But meat is definitely what's missing. Right? And I'm not surprised that so many of you caught up to that, because America is one of the countries that eats the most meat in the world. Only Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and some parts around here in, let's see, what would that be? Malaysia eat as much meat, right, as we do. Right? The average person in America, right, this is kilograms per person, eats between 220 and, like 330 pounds of meat every year. Peasants ate virtually none. Now, there is no exit slip. We're just going to keep rolling with our notes because I want to get you guys caught up to the other hours. Again, it's not your fault that we're behind. It's just kind of how it's worked out. As a peasant, remember, one of the things that determines your life is what you have to provide to your Lord. You were responsible for providing your Lord with 2 to 3 days of labor on land that was just his. You would be planting, weeding, harvesting, and none of that is for the food you are going to eat. And what's worse, even on the food you did grow for yourself, you had to pay a tax, right, to grind that grain at the Lord's mill. You were not allowed to grind your own grain. Because if you could grind your own grain, then you didn't have to pay taxes to the Lord. And if you could grind your own grain, the Lord might not actually know how much you had harvested and therefore how much tax you needed to pay. Right? So you can't grind your own grain. You're also not allowed to bake your own bread. There was a communal oven on the estate to bake your bread. Well, sure, but it's about control.
Did they have light bulbs? How is
No.
that going to control its bread?
Well, no, just that they want to manage very carefully what they're able to take from you. And if you can grind your own grain and bake your own bread, they don't know what you've produced, and they don't know what they should tax. But by doing this, they know exactly what you've produced because you bring that amount to grind and you bake that much bread, right? And so it's about just your Lord being able to control you as an individual, right? That's the thing. And it's hard for us to contemplate, right, a ruler wanting to have that much control over the little details of our lives, but that's what it's about. You also weren't allowed to leave your Lord's manor, right, the estate that you lived on, without permission. And you were only allowed to marry with the permission of your Lord. And you had to pay a tax to do it. Right? No tax, no marriage. You were also required to pay the church a tithe. A tithe is 10% of your income. Right? And it goes back to the Old Testament, that people were supposed to sacrifice the first 10% of their produce, whether it was crops or livestock. And the church required you to pay that by giving them 10% of your income. That was required by law. Some people, in this country, people do it by choice. But even to this day, in countries like Germany and Sweden, the government takes tax money from you and uses it to support the official state church, right? Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's right. No, here, lots of people still do it, and they still give 10%, but they do it by choice. Nobody requires them to do it. Here, it was just like another tax. Okay, let's stop there. All right, please save and upload your notes.